26. This whirling about of the dry leaves reached deep into him and fixed his attention for as long as it lasted, until, that is, the last of the leaves had blown away and left nothing but brown branches and the green ground. His mind could not get away from this. Dry and dead were ideas that came to his mind, though he had little grasp of what it meant for something to be dry, and no sense at all of what dead meant. As he brooded in the park and moved up and down the street, groping within himself for a stronger signal, new things like leaves began to fall to the ground. But they weren't coming from the trees. They weren't red, and they were much smaller. For the first time in many a day, he turned his attention upward into the space above the trees, which had just been more chaos the last time he had regarded it. Now it was a dull white. Small leaves of a brighter white were falling out of it. A few at first, then more, in such quantities as to dwarf the number of leaves. They collected among the tiny green leaves that constituted the ground, and began to accumulate and climb up those tiny stalks, just as the red leaves had before climbed up the trunks of the trees. In time, enough of them had descended that they covered the green entirely, and made the whole ground white. The park was a different place altogether now from what it had once been. But he mastered a fear that the red beauty would never return. For many days he gazed down the length of the street at the shapes of the branches against the white ground. At night he looked up into the sky, which sometimes was merely a gray fog out of which more white flakes descended. At other times, though, it was black, and decorated with brilliant points of light. When first he took note of these, they were scattered about in no particular way, which put him in mind of chaos and therefore displeased him. But on longer inspection, he began to see shapes in the stars, just as he had, eons ago, seen a leaf emerge from the chaos. The more he attended to those shapes, the clearer and more perfectly formed they became, as the stars shifted and arranged themselves across the dark in a manner that better suited him. He knew not, however, what the shapes they described were. The only shapes in his world were leaves and trees. The figures in the stars, though beautiful, could not be likened to those. Sometimes a white flake would stick to the dark trunk of a tree, and he would gaze closely at it. Early the trunk and the flake both were simple and featureless, but he knew this to be another thing that required bettering. By attending more carefully, he drew forth greater complexity from both. The smooth trunk developed furrows and ridges. The white flake grew 6 arms, each sharing the same shape, which branched like that of a tree's boughs or a leaf's veins. The whirling dry leaves ceased to be his main preoccupation and became a mere memory. The bareness of the place made the simplicity of its shape obvious, and he saw wrongness in that. It had been nothing to him in the beginning, when he had had so much red beauty to beguile him. But now that he had seen the complexity of shapes that emerged from the concerted movements of the dry leaves, and that the stars described in the night sky, he thought it wrong that the ground itself should have a form so plain. So he dissolved adamant into chaos for a brief time, during which he elevated the park and made the street climb to it, and let the forest slope away on its other side. The street was too straight, and so he allowed it to bend this way and that. The slope of the forest he complicated and made more perfect by making it tend up and down in places, like the surface of a leaf when it has begun to turn brown and has ceased to be flat. In like manner, he indented the face of the ground with grooves and connected them in a way that recalled the branchings of the veins in a leaf. When it was shaped to his liking, he made it adamant once more, fixing it thus. Now, when he looked one way from the park, he could see the street curving this way and that as it descended the slope, and when he looked the other way, he could see the white ground of the forest, scratched with the countless brown branches of the trees, heaving up in some places, and in others plunging into the declivities that were shot through its flesh. Something told him that the time had come to bring the street, the park, and the forest back to their original form, though with greater perfection. As when the leaves had refused to go away, he did not have any thought of what to do about the deep snow, as he had named the white stuff. But then one day he noted that no flakes had fallen from the sky for a while, and that the level of the snow was descending the trunks of the trees. Patches of ground appeared, then grew until little, then no snow was left. When he looked down into the forest, he heard a sound that was like the chaos, and feared for a moment that all he had built was unraveling. But descending through the forest to investigate, he found the veins in the land carrying away the melted snow. At first it ran straight and hissed at him. Sensing that this was wrong, he attended to it for a time, and made it whirl, course, and leap like the wind that had carried away the leaves, but more visible and louder. But after he had improved it, its loudness was not the stupid hiss of the chaos, but a pleasing rush and burble. The ground was all black adamant, as if the memory of green had faded, but presently returned to its correct color as the tiny leaves reconstituted themselves. Bigger leaves appeared on the tree's branches, red at first, until he sensed that this was a mistake, and that they ought to be green in the beginning. So the time of the white and the black was replaced by a time where nearly everything was green. He looked into the sky one day when things seemed uncommonly bright, and saw a brilliant thing shining down from it, and later noticed that it was moving across the sky in a steady arc. He knew somehow that this was correct, and later discovered sun in his memory. In due course, moon followed. The green time led to a changing of the leaves' colors, so that one day, with a feeling of satisfaction and even triumph, he was able to gaze down the length of the street from the park and see the whole place just as he had first seen it at the beginning, save that everything about it was much more perfectly rendered than at first. Seasons were these gradual changes in the color and the shape of the place, and he knew that, having gone round through one cycle, it would happen again without the need for him to work it all out and fix problems. Just to satisfy himself of that, he looked on with much less problem-fixing as the leaves fell again and made the red lake, and turned brown and scuttled about in the wind, and were replaced by the snow and then the green. The seasons were 4, and they made up a year. He let several years cycle, inspecting and improving matters as he went along. All of the seasons were beautiful and pleasing in different ways, and all of the changes more or less interesting, but the part of the year that most troubled him, in the sense of a thing that pulled at his mind in some manner he could not satisfy, was the scuttling of the dry leaves at the beginning of the winter. One year, when the trees had all turned red, he noticed the first leaf of autumn drifting to the ground. It skated and turned on an invisible breeze that was at the same time stirring the branches of the trees. He descended from the park and moved down the street and approached the leaf to inspect it. It was an especially brilliant specimen, not yet purpling with age, its veins a radiant yellow. A bad thing happened to him then, a glimpse of resurgent chaos, as if the fabric he had so laboriously woven and perfected had been torn open in one place, and he were gazing through the hole at a much older and less well-formed version of it, seeing not a beautiful leaf, but a patch of chaos, with only a few red motes. It was a degree of ill-formedness he had not had to endure for a very large number of days and years, and it put him in mind of the time at the very beginning when he had suffered through the eons of chaos and grasped desperately at even a single mote of red. This was troubling to him. He recoiled from it and went back up the street to the park. From that commanding height he could gaze down upon that one single leaf, lying there alone on the green grass, and brood over what had just happened. He was reluctant to go near it again. In time, though, he began to take it amiss that he was so fearful of this one leaf. Had he not brought all of this into being out of chaos? Could he not do it again? Could it be that this was a harbinger, a warning that something was wrong in what he had made, and that he might need to go and better it? So he went back down to inspect the leaf again. It was just a leaf. No wrongness in it. And yet he sensed something in its vicinity that was of a much lower order of perfection, so crude and low that it lacked even a visible form, that was seeing it all wrong, trying to drag the leaf down to its level, the level he had once existed at. It puzzled and troubled him for a long while, until he came suddenly to understand that there was another like him, or rather, like what he had once been. He was not alone. Others could exist, did exist, who independently could experience what he had experienced in times long past. One of them had found its way here. This, the idea that others of his kind could exist and could share his world, had never once entered his thinking during the whole time since he had become conscious, and it led to long brooding up in the park. Like other revelations that had come to his mind over the eons, it was at once completely astonishing and strangely familiar. Of course there would be others, just as the first leaf that he had brought forth out of the chaos had in time proved to be only one of many that were like it but different, and just as the same had proved true of trees and snowflakes, how could it not be the case that he himself was only one instance of a thing, a pattern of which others could exist? Perhaps others as numberless as the leaves or the snowflakes. He understood all of this, but he did not like it. It displeased him that when he came down out of the park to look at this perfect leaf, his experience of it was interfered with, marred, by the crudeness with which the other saw it. He wanted to eject this wretched thing, to make it go away. But the mere thought of doing so led his thinking down strange paths. To liken himself to one leaf or one snowflake was to raise troubling matters, more disturbing than anything he had experienced since he had lain paralyzed while the chaos had washed over him for eons. For many years now, leaves had come into existence, only to fall, dry up, and blow away when their time was at an end. Likewise, snowflakes had covered the ground, only to melt, merge, and rush away through the declivities in the forest. One snowflake softened and merged with another, and multitudes of them became rills high in the crown of the park. Rills merged with each other at the branchings to form creeks. Creeks became streams. Streams became a river. It all went away so that the next season could follow in its time. He had never troubled himself with the question of where the leaves blew away to and what became of them, nor of where the river flowed. Such concerns were idle and in no way affected him. But if he were now to conceive of himself as only one leaf on a tree, or tree in a forest, and if he were to admit of the possibility of others like him coming along to abide in the same place, then he must, in order to make the thought whole and perfect and sound as it ought to be, consider whether he and others of his kind were destined to fall and be carried away on a wind, or melt and merge with others and rush away to parts unknown. Such thoughts led to no firm conclusion, but, over long days and nights of brooding, he came to understand that he ought to form about himself a shape, and to clothe that shape in a boundary such that on one side of it was him, and on the other side was not him, somewhat as the trees were covered in bark. He began to make this so, but with no fixed idea at first as to what its form ought to be. He could adopt the form of a tree, but sensed that this was not correct. Trees were what he looked at, not what he was. One night he was gazing up at the stars. Some time ago these had, partly of their own accord, and partly through his idle musings, adopted forms that were not like those of trees, but whose nature he could not quite understand. It came to him then that they were a kind of message. In their shapes were suggestions as to how he might pattern his own form. He tried various shapes, one long and sinuous, one squat with several legs, and one that stood upright with a head at the top where the looking and the hearing took place, and appendages below that which could be put to various uses. This one, he sensed, was correct. He worked with it through all of the days that the leaves were falling. He saw now that this shape had always been implicit in the way that he had moved about and experienced things. What was a street but a place where he could walk? For that, legs were needed. His long habit of gazing at fallen leaves suggested that he was looking at things from a place that was above the ground, but below the height of the branches from which the leaves fell. This, he now understood, matched up well with having a head perched some modest distance above his legs. Leaves could be snatched out of the air and held up for inspection by separate limbs, mounted just below the head. At the ends of those limbs were platforms for supporting leaves. Sprouting from the edges of those platforms were smaller, finer appendages, suitable for poking at snowflakes. He could make them curl inward, just as the projecting armlets of a leaf did as it dried out. But unlike a dry leaf, these did not shrivel and die once so curled, but could be re-straightened at will. The winds of autumn came and made the dry leaves whirl about. He sensed it would be a good thing to have the power of such movement, and so he altered his form, adding another pair of appendages, somewhat leaf-like in their shape. These had the power of catching the wind and gave him the freedom to rise up off the ground and join the leaves in their whirling and their careering through the air. As he did so, he sensed that others were around him, whirling about just like the dry leaves did, caught up helplessly in the dry, cold wind, unable to master their own movements as he was able to do. He understood then why the whirling of the dry leaves had held such fascination for him since the first time he had beheld it. It was what others of his kind did when they lacked the power to do otherwise. When they had only just come to this place. When they had only just died. He was dead.